Evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on shaping the narrative for entrepreneurs in collaboration with Bank One. I am your host, Swarna Gajada, the Business Development and Program Officer at Turbine Incubator. Today's event is quite a special one. Not only do we have an amazing speaker joining us, we are also excited to share that we have approximately 40 individuals connecting from Workshop 17 in Mocha, comprising of startups, coaches, and not to forget our partner, Bank One and their community. Our guest today is Mimi Kalinda, a global communications expert with 25 years of experience in developing, implementing, and measuring impactful strategies across Africa, Europe, and the United States. In this webinar, we will chat about the importance of shaping the narrative and how entrepreneurs can create compelling stories for their businesses. Mimi, thank you for joining us again. And you have such a remarkable journey. Would you mind telling us a bit more about yourself and your path that led you to your world of public relations?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Swarna. This is a real honor and very been looking forward to this. And good morning, good afternoon. I think it's afternoon also in
Yeah,
Mauritius
it's 6
now.
p.m.
So good afternoon to everybody there. Yeah, when you say 25 years, it's a little bit scary to me because I haven't seen the time fly. It's actually gone by very quickly. So 25 years seems like a very big number. But my journey, although my journey hasn't been solely in public relations as a pillar within the media space, I have been in the media space for 25 years. I started my career actually in front of the camera as a presenter. They used to call them presenters in those days. I worked for, on DSTV. I worked for a music television channel called Channel O. Which came out in the 90s, at some point in the 90s. And then my career evolved into content production. So I worked and lived in London working for MTV for a number of years, both as a presenter as well as a producer. So I produced my own shows at MTV that went out to Europe as well as the feed into Africa. And that was a great time. MTV, as you know, was a super innovative concept when it launched. And in the 90s, I think it was probably at its peak in terms of reach and shaping popular culture. I also I became super passionate at MTV about the impact of the media on shaping perceptions, and specifically once you've shaped perceptions, you're able to shape behaviors as well. So I went into the field of behavior change communications. And behavior change communications is really, I think, a continuously growing field that's being studied and implemented by people in the communications industry. And was in New York City. So I moved to New York where I attended NYU. I did a degree in media studies. Um, and then while I was at NYU, really immersed myself behind the scenes, right, of the media. So I did everything that you can think of: advertising, production, ad sales, all of those things. So I worked at HBO, Showtime, Oxygen, Lifetime, every network that you can think of in the US. I probably touched on a little bit, but I was pulled in and mentored by a film director called Spike Lee, who's an African American film director, based in Brooklyn. So worked for his company, 40 Acres and a Mule, and worked on a number of different movies with him, and then moved to the DRC, where I set up a production company, and I worked with USAID on a program called Rien que la Vérité. And Rien que la Vérité is really about behavior change communications. We spoke about subjects like HIV, AIDS, violence against women, etc. All of these kind of mission-driven communication issues. And then I moved back to South Africa, where I worked for Weber Shandwick, which is a global public relations firm. I led their social impact practice. Flashman Hillard, I did a couple of years there, leading their business across Africa. And I set up my own PR company about 10 years ago called Africa Communications Group out of Johannesburg, but with offices across the continent. And now we've just partnered with a firm in Spain that bought some shares in our company, and so we're expanding outside of Africa to be able to cover other geographies as well.
That's quite
That's a
wonderful.
summary of 25 years. It's not easy, but it's a summary of 25 years of work. Yes.
Not that long ago. That's quite wonderful. That's a really amazing journey that you have. And you said something about shaping the narrative, and I wanted to know more about where did you get the seed and why is shaping the narrative something so special for you?
Yeah, so shaping the narrative is important because I think a lot of the time when we talk about narrative, storytelling, communications, it might come across as something very high level, very theoretical, very kind of quote unquote fluffy, that doesn't have real implications in people's lives, right? But, I mean, I'd like to take you and, our colleagues listening on the call as well. When you think about the ideas that you have about the world, right? How the world functions, what is your place in it, the stakeholders that you work with on a day-to-day basis, Mauritius itself as a country, the stories that we've been told and the stories that we've heard shape how we see the world in which we live, the country in which we live, the businesses that we build, but also the businesses that we interact with. So everything has been shaped by narrative and has been shaped by stories. So I'll give you an example. Who said that Paris is the most romantic city in the world, right? Like, I mean, that story was deliberately and strategically formed, as a narrative around the city of Paris. But the real implications of that is that Paris as a city attracts every year millions and millions of visitors who go to it, spend money, invest in that money goes into the economy of the country, etc., because of this narrative that has been formed. Another example would be one of the brands that I love working with is Nike, for example, right? I mean, do we buy Nike shoes or Nike sneakers because they have anything that's more special than any other brand, right? I don't think so. We buy them because there's a narrative around Nike. There's a feeling that we get, there's a perception that we have around what Nike represents as a brand. And so they've been able to build this multi-million-dollar business. So I think that's, for me, is why narrative is very important, is because it's not just about storytelling, but the stories that we tell have very real implications in terms of the bottom line, fiscally and financially for businesses, but also at a higher level. When you talk about a country level, I work a lot with governments, for example, across the continent, and I say to them, a lot of investment, if you invest in your image, if you invest in brand building, if you invest in narrative, that's going to have very real implications in terms of tourism, foreign direct investment, GDP, and eventually economic growth.
Yeah. So why do you, I see from the research that I made, I see that you're a really strong advocate about shaping the narrative for Africa. Why is it so important to be shaping a new narrative for Africa? Because, like, I know it dates back to years ago of Africa being the place for slaves, the market for slaves, and but today, after so many years of progress and development globally, why do you still believe that shaping the narrative for Africa is so important?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to what I've just said around real implications, real economic implications, political stability, social cohesion. Everything goes back to kind of the stories that are shared and the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell others, right? So, a few years ago, The Economist had a cover story around Africa, and the title of that story was The Hopeless Continent, right? So when we talk about the hopeless continent, what does that actually mean in terms of the implications of the people who live on this continent? When our leaders go to global forums and they need to negotiate deals that have direct impact on your life and my life, if the image of our continent is one that is hopeless, what happens, right? How does that impact those sorts of discussions? How does that impact the ability or the willingness of people to come and invest on the continent? And when they do come to invest, what does that mean in terms of the leverage that we have when it comes to negotiating with our global counterparts? So I think that's why it's really important. And then if you fast forward a couple of years later, the very same magazine, The Economist, had the title Africa Rising. So we went from being the hopeless continent to Africa rising. And the implications of that in terms of our growth, in terms of our voice on global platforms, and all of those things follow that type of narrative as well. And I think that's, for me, is the importance of the media. So I think that's why, for me, it's very, very important that we kind of advocate, that we tell great stories, because there are fantastic stories in Africa of people doing incredible things. I mean, these entrepreneurs that are sitting in that room themselves are contributors to the African story. And so, we need to be telling more of those stories in order to create an ecosystem where Africa as a continent can have leverage and can be in a position to grow and to also gain a sense of respectability on the global stage.
That's wonderful because you are basically paving the way for African entrepreneurs to reach larger markets globally. And as an incubator, we work very closely with entrepreneurs, and we've noticed that a lot of times they struggle with challenges around building their identity and being somebody. We are on an island, on a really small island, but part of the African continent. So it's quite difficult for us to put ourselves out there and shape our story in a way that gets really attractive for our international counterparts. So how and where do you believe and do you recommend that entrepreneurs need to start building their own story?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, let me just commend, even though you are an island, I think the narrative, right? I mean, I've seen it evolve over the years, and I think that the story of Mauritius is one of economic growth. It's one of just accelerated leapfrogging a lot of what's happening, not just on the continent, but around the world, which is fantastic. So then that brings me to the story of entrepreneurs. I think, like you said, the great thing about what's happening on the continent right now is that actions are starting to follow the narrative, right? So, about the African Free Trade Area Agreement, for example. We know that that is something that, if implemented properly, is really going to give entrepreneurs from all over the continent, private sector, the opportunity to trade across borders that are much more fluid. And that's going to really, I think, have a fantastic impact on how we do business on the continent. I do think, however, a big part of communications, I always say communications is probably 60% speaking and 40% listening, right? And a big part of communications on the continent, specifically when it comes to entrepreneurs, is really making an effort to understand the context and the nuances and the dynamics that are applicable in other African countries, right? So when we say, if I'm sitting in Johannesburg, South Africa today, and I want to do business in Nigeria, and I work with entrepreneurs, South African entrepreneurs that want to do business in Nigeria, for example. But there's so much to learn about the way of doing business in a country like Nigeria that is huge, humongous, full of opportunity, but also extremely complex.
Mm.
I recently worked with a client that started a business in Nigeria in the fintech space, and they got into a little bit of trouble with some of the regulators and just kind of not understanding how, from a policy and regulation perspective, how Nigeria works as a country. And while we were sorting that out, we kept having conversations about how the culture in Nigeria is so different from South
Yeah.
Africa. So the culture in Nigeria is a very interpersonal culture. When I do business in Nigeria, it's sometimes very difficult to just pick up the phone, and close the deal over the phone or send an email. People will say, well, Mimi, when are you coming to Lagos? When are we meeting? We need to meet. We need to break bread. We need to talk. I need to shake your hand. I need to have an interpersonal
Yeah.
relationship with you that will facilitate the business conversations that we're having. And every country in the world, but every country on the continent has very unique
Mm.
nuances, cultural nuances, traditional nuances, ways of doing business, political landscape. All of these things influence how people do business in any given context. And those are really important things to take into consideration when we think about expanding.
So, what are some common mistakes that you have identified and you have come across with the companies and entrepreneurs that you work with throughout your experience? Because, as you mentioned, there was one that the company that you were talking about who did not understand the culture of Nigeria, and I completely agree with you that you have to really understand the culture of the countries that you're trying to reach, because this in India is might be no, but in another country might mean yes. So there's a lot of barriers that you need to cross. So yeah, so what are a few mistakes that are quite common that people can kind of easily avoid?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think what I've touched on in terms of culture is a really big thing. I think also understanding the needs of that particular environment in which you're going to go and do business, right? So, so South Africa, for example, is quite a developed country in a number of different sectors. So retail, manufacturing, etc. There, of course, there's still gaps in any sector and any industry that you're going to work with, but really understanding how your product is ultimately adding value, right? Adding value and closing a gap in any market, right? So I'm actually reading a very interesting book at the moment. It's by a US economist, and it essentially talks about how ideas are scalable. And they did a number of different studies about, you might have a sample, so a country, a community, a group of people in which you try out an idea. And at the end of that idea, you think, well, this is perfect because it's working in this environment, it's working in this
Yeah.
community, it's working in this country. And then you think, well, because it's working here, surely it will be scalable in another environment, in another context, etc. And you copy and paste the same methodology. So I think, and the book essentially talks about how there are specific criteria that one has to look for to determine if an idea is going to be scalable in
Mhm.
different environments, right? And I think a lot of the time we know what we know. We place importance on things that we think are really important, but those may not necessarily be the things that land in another context, in another environment, or another geography. So I
Yeah.
think really doing your research. And one of the things that I also found is that, especially in the digital age where we have access to so much information, you can sit in Mauritius and do a lot of research about Namibia, for example, or Botswana, and find a lot of things online about the regulatory environment in Namibia, who you should be doing business with. You can connect with people on LinkedIn. You can start to build relationships, etc. But I deeply believe that nothing replaces actually being in an environment. So,
Yeah.
if you're going to build a business, if you're going to invest somewhere, really making the investment of going there, being able to see, to smell, to touch, to speak to people, etc. They are little nuances that one can pick up in that kind of by doing that you'll never ever be able to get online. And I've worked with a number of entrepreneurs who, for example, wanted to go from Kenya to Tanzania. And you think, well, Kenya, Tanzania, East Africa, it's very close. It's pretty much the same country. It's the same family. Why bother? But the differences are actually enormous from one
Yeah.
country to the next, and sometimes even within the same country, right? So I've lived in South Africa. I was born in the DRC. So when you look at the DRC and the Congo, you think, oh my gosh, this is, the second biggest country on the continent. But people apply a blanket approach to markets, right? And I can tell you, doing business in the eastern part of the
Mm.
DRC is very, very different to doing business in Kinshasa. So it's just really kind of getting an understanding of those nuances that makes a real difference.
So what tips do you have to adapt your story to be able to have at least a base to for multiple cultures?
Yeah, so I think the first one is understanding what your story is, right? You have to deeply understand your own story, your own value proposition before you're able to get anybody else to believe in it, right? So when we do communication strategies with entrepreneurs, the very first thing that we start off with is what we call messaging. What is your messaging? And within your messaging structure, are questions that you have to ask yourself, such as why? Why are you particularly suited, but also why are you bringing this solution to the marketplace? And how do you speak about your why, right? That's really, really important. I'll give you an example. So Swarna identifies a challenge in the marketplace and says, I want to solve this, for example, right? And I'm going to build a business to solve this particular challenge. And I really think that Swana's challenge that she's trying to solve is a very, very important one. But I am not particularly attracted to that challenge. I'm attracted to another challenge that I want to solve as an entrepreneur, right? But the challenge that Swan is attracted to might be driven by her experience, her background, maybe how she grew up, the things that she saw growing up, the people that she interacted with. There's something about you as the entrepreneur that has made it so that you particularly has decided to solve that particular problem. And I think building a narrative around that is really, really important. So, one of the things I always tell my clients is people buy into people before they buy into ideas or concepts or companies. And if you're able to sell yourself and understand your own story as an entrepreneur, that's a great first step, right? So the messaging,
Yeah.
the why is really, really important. The second thing also to keep in mind is the who. Who are you serving, right? Because I think that as entrepreneurs, we're not just selling a service, we're not just selling a product or a service, we're actually serving people, other human beings that
Yeah.
need what we're bringing to the table, right? So, really having an understanding of your stakeholders and having an understanding of your audience is extremely important. And when we do what we call stakeholder mapping, so in public relations, we have this concept of doing kind of stakeholder mapping, which is we map out all of your stakeholders. And stakeholders are people who influence your business, but also people who you influence with your business, right? So they could be your employees, they could be the media, they could be government, if you deal with government as part of your business, day-to-day activities, whatever, all of your stakeholders. Now, the interesting thing about stakeholders is that each stakeholder has their own agenda as well, right? They have their own agenda. And what you're trying to do is match your story and your agenda with their agenda. The reason that's important is because when we are subject matter experts and when we are passionate about what we do, we tend to think that what we do is the most important thing in the entire world. And therefore, why isn't everybody passionate about this? Why isn't everybody listening to us? Why isn't everybody opening all the doors and giving us all the opportunities? But the importance of doing stakeholder mapping is understanding that the people that you're speaking to also have their own agenda. They're trying to accomplish their own thing. So it's also about being able to adapt your story in such a way that it lands with your stakeholders in a way that really makes sense, right? So those things for me are kind of the beginning thing. What is your message? What is who are you serving and how can you build a story around that? The last thing that I will add around that is that, you've heard often people say, I want to be a thought leader, right? That's a big thing right now. Everyone wants to be a thought leader, and I want to be an influencer in my space, and I want to be a thought leader, which is fantastic. We should all be thought leaders, but unfortunately, we cannot all be thought leaders about the same thing, right? So let's take financial inclusion as an example. So you're in the business of building tools and services and products that will advance financial inclusion within a specific context. Great. But financial inclusion is such a big umbrella, right? It's such a big subject. What part of financial inclusion do you want to be a thought leader about? Right? So it's really asking yourself over and over and over. The question that I like to ask my clients is, so what? So we start off here, right? Financial inclusion. Okay, I want to do this. So what? And then you bring it down. So what? And then you bring it down until you get to the real essence of what you're trying to communicate. And then that starts to form your messaging strategy and your storytelling strategy and your narrative.
That's quite interesting. I want to bounce back on something that you said about people buying into people. And one of the questions that I have is about, a lot of times entrepreneurs, like startups come from the story of an entrepreneur, like you said, like somebody's upbringing, experiences, and this is what led them towards creating the startup and the business that they have. And I want to know, like, should an entrepreneur separate their own story from that of their business? Or if they have to separate, like, how do they do that? Because it's very personal to them, but it still has to reach multiple countries, multiple platforms. So what would you say is the best technique to keep their story, or find a way to just dilute it, or whatever? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a great question, Swarna, and one that I find that I get often because a lot of entrepreneurs ask themselves this question. I like to kind of give the example of myself, right? Because I'm an entrepreneur, and that's why I'm super passionate about other entrepreneurs and how they can tell their story. When I started my business 10 years ago, I was competing within the PR space. I was competing with big global public relation companies, right? Some of
Yeah.
them had more than 100 years of experience. Others had millions of dollars to be able to invest in advertising and client acquisition and all of these things. I didn't have any of that. The only thing that I had was my communication skill that I
Yeah.
had learned and nurtured over a number of years. So I said to myself, what can I use to compete with these guys? The only thing that I have is to compete with my story, because being able to tell my story, to be able to communicate my story with passion and all of that, and to build a PR framework around my own name as the entrepreneur is the only thing that's going to help me compete within the landscape that I was the ecosystem in which I was competing. And so I actually made myself a client of my own PR company. And I had people pitching my story to the media and writing stories and doing social media and all of those things. Not because I wanted to be famous, because that was the only tool in my box, in my toolbox that I could utilize to start to build momentum and visibility for my business. So the first part of my answer is, what do you have in your toolbox? What do you have in your toolbox right now that you can use to start telling your story and to build visibility and talkability around your business, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as the company evolved, the needs for communications also evolved. So
Mhm.
I told you at the beginning that my business was acquired 2 years ago in 2021. We were acquired, and it was really interesting because just before we were acquired, we changed the communication approach and we started to build the brand of the business. And I started to take a step back, right? I started to take a step back. We did a lot more work with the brand, ACG, we were everywhere, etc. And every time we had an opportunity, I would push another member of the team to go and do an interview, to go and do this, etc. Because we really wanted to build the visibility of the brand itself. The reason is that otherwise, if I was acquired tomorrow, what am I selling? The person acquiring me is buying me and not buying the company.
Yeah.
And that's not what I wanted, right? I wanted to make sure that I was actually selling the company, the work of the company, the clients, and all of those kinds of things, and not selling me as an individual. So the second part of my answer is that your communication can evolve. Just because you start off doing one thing doesn't mean that that's the same thing that you're going to keep doing 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, right? It has to evolve. As you evolve as an entrepreneur, the communications around your company also has to evolve and follow.
That that's really interesting because a lot of times people don't know when to take a step back because that's basically their baby. I would like to invite everyone on the call, even in the room, to get your questions ready. Those on the call, feel free to send your questions in the chat. We'll be starting the Q&A soon. During the Our Communication campaign for the webinar, we received a few questions from our community. And one of the questions we got was, what was one of the reasons for scaling your business despite reaching financial stability?
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. So currently, I'm starting to build around my business a great leadership team and the infrastructure for me to be able to move into a different role in my business, right? And for me, I think of businesses almost like you mentioned earlier, like that's your baby. It's kind of, it's like a child that you've put out into the world and you have to see them evolve, right? But isn't it interesting that we talk about our businesses like babies, but yet we hold on to them even sometimes when they've become teenagers or
Mm.
adults? I always say if you're doing the same thing, I don't. There's a very very interesting book that I recommend everybody read. It's called "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," and the concept is that whatever you did to get to where you are today is not going to be what you're going to need to do to get to where you need to go tomorrow. And that's the same thing with leadership. When you're a leader, your idea is to also be a self-aware. You need to be a self-aware leader to know when your type of leadership is no longer applicable to what you're trying to build, right? So there comes a point where you have to really be honest with yourself and say, is my type of leadership going to help this baby, this teenage business, adolescent business become an adult? Or do I need to expand? Do I need to bring in other partners? Do I need to bring in other people who are going to add a different kind of value to this business, right? And that's kind of where I was with my business as well.
Let's just take it as the education system, moving from the primary to secondary schooling to tertiary schooling.
Exactly.
That's quite interesting. And there was another question that we had, which was about a few challenges that businesses usually encounter, like apart from capital or business plan or human resource management, what are maybe some other big challenges that one can come across?
Yeah, actually, I did a survey on LinkedIn a while ago because I had the same question and I wanted my community to come back with some answers. So the four challenges that I was able to identify, obviously there was capital, and there was scalability. The other one that came up quite high was visibility for my business. But if nobody knows about it, then you're a little bit stuck. So visibility is another challenge that came up. And then another one, which I thought was quite interesting that my community told me, was networking, right?
Mm,
Just having the right networks, having the right people who can open the right doors, who can, sometimes it's not even about opening the doors, it's about having people who can speak your name in rooms that you don't have access to, right? And then that helps your business kind of go to the next level. So for me, those are probably some of the biggest challenges that we face as entrepreneurs.
Another question that we received from the audience in the room there is that you mentioned that your company has been acquired. After how many years of operation has this company been acquired? And if you have, and if you can share the story with us, did you go looking for the acquisition or were you approached? The question is
Yeah.
from Noor Sharif from the room there.
Yeah, great question. So it was acquired in 2021. So we're turning 10 this year. So we were 8 at the time when we were acquired. And it happened quite organically, actually. I think probably in my mind, I had put it out in the universe that I wanted to have a partner. But the company that acquired us was a partner company that we had been working with. They're based in Spain, they service Europe, and they acquired us at a time where we had done quite a bit of work together. So we were their Africa partner, and we produced a lot of really excellent work, great campaigns, etc., over a period of time. And so they were starting to get interested because they were like, you're doing such great work for us, wouldn't it be interesting if we just kind of became one,
Mm,
right? But at the time also, we had three different companies that had approached us for acquisition. And so we went through a due diligence process and all of that. But we ended up going with the one where we felt we had the better relationship. So even though other people, might have come to the table with, you know, bigger paycheck, a lot of promises, etc. For me, relationships are very, very important, because ultimately it's like getting married, right? You
yeah.
get married and then you find out, once you're married, you have to live with this person for 20 years, 30 years, and you want to be married to somebody that you really like, right? So for me, that was kind of the decision making process.
That's quite interesting. Let's just see if there are other people on the call who would like to ask a few questions. In the meantime, I have another one that I received, which is, what do you think is the key to connect with your community or niche market through the storytelling?
Hmm, great question. Niche market. Okay, so I really think it depends what it is that you do, what sector you're in, what you're selling, and all of those kinds of things. But like what I said at the beginning around really understanding your stakeholders, right? So, I've worked with clients in kind of, who are big corporates or, small companies that have, very niche needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the energy sector specifically, I've done a lot of work there. um, but it's really understanding what is, what makes sense? What do people want to hear? What's interesting to them, right? What's really interesting to those people? From a communications perspective, one of the things I always push my team to do is also from a media perspective. How many times I've had clients come to me and say, please, I want to be on BBC. I want to be on CNN. Please, can you help me to get a story on Al Jazeera or on France 24 or on RFI or whatever? And my question to them is always, is that the ego that's speaking? Or is it really going to help you achieve your objectives? Because you have one story on BBC, and maybe that story doesn't even speak to your target audience, because your target audience reads a very niche magazine or listens to a podcast, or actually what they prefer is to have one-on-one engagements, which is also a form of communication, or small round tables or discussions or forums, etc. So what I would say is that your communication and your storytelling has to be fit for the purpose for which you are doing it, right? And this actually brings me to a very important point that I wanted to make at the beginning, which is, just like everything else, communication and storytelling has to have a return on investment, right? It has to have a return on investment, because you are spending time as an entrepreneur. You're spending money communicating, building all of these things, etc. You have to be very clear from the beginning what is going to be your return on investment in this communication campaign or work that you're doing, right? Is it going to be more client acquisition? Is it going to be more partnerships? Is it going to be, and how will you know when you are actually succeeding? Right? Because a lot of people think communication is, I'm going to have social media page. I'm going to be on LinkedIn. I'm going to be on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Then I'm going to do a little bit of media. And they're just doing what they see everybody else doing because it's trendy and because it seems like the right thing to do, right? But it's not strategic, and it's not fit for your purpose, for your company, for your story. So that's really important. I wanted to share that.
So not everybody has to be on TikTok.
Absolutely not everybody, but some of us have to be on TikTok if it's fit for the purpose.
Of course. Yeah. Another question that we have is, after all your years in business, what is a question that you wish people asked more about entrepreneurship?
Wow, that's such a great question. My goodness. I'll share again from my own experience, probably. Like when I first started building my business, I thought that it was going to be a legacy business, i.e., that I was going to own this business forever. And maybe one day my children would inherit the business, or my grandchildren. And this is such a passion that I have, etc. What I didn't consider was that to build a business as a legacy and to build a business to sell the business one day are two completely different things. You have to do different things. You have to build different processes. You have to deliberately build different systems. I think a lot of the time when entrepreneurs start businesses, we just want to get going, right? We want to start getting money in the bank. We want to start acquiring customers and clients, etc. And we don't think about, if somebody came into the business today and wanted to buy this business, what are they buying? What are they buying, right? And I wish that entrepreneurs ask themselves that question more often, earlier in the process, as opposed to much later
on. I think we might have time for one last question. Do we have anything from the room? Would anybody like to ask something? Marie, would you mind unmuting your sound? Yes, we have one at the back.
Hey, Mimi, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Really amazing resume. My name is Munya, and I run a company, Lakestream. We're basically a B2B SaaS company, and we're targeting landlords owning one or two assets in the range of 1 to 2 million. And I think you touched on a few interesting concepts, Al Jazeera, CNN, TikTok, all of these different listen channels. I think my question is, where are you seeing traction? Which channels are attracting these small to medium-sized SMEs in key markets? Think Zambia, think Ghana, think Kenya. What's attracting attention?
Interesting. Okay, well, no, thanks for the question. So which channels have the most traction? Wow. That's a difficult one, right? I mean, I think it really depends on the business, but because you've given me a little bit of context on yours, I think so. Let's divide them into kind of traditional communication channels and then digital communication channels. So, from a digital communications perspective, I think that LinkedIn is so far my absolute favorite channel for small businesses in the B2B space, right? I mean, because again, like when we look at the kind of world of digital, you have your Facebooks, your TikToks, etc. But when you think about the audience that's on LinkedIn, that's a really kind of prepped audience for that, right? The other thing about LinkedIn that I really like, and I don't know if you've seen the functionalities, but it's really evolved over the years, right? So it's not just a platform where you go and kind of you put one post every 2 weeks or whatever. Going back to the concept that I was talking about around return on investment, think about building a community on LinkedIn. It's not about you just sharing information out into the world, right? It's about building a community of conversation. And LinkedIn nowadays allows you to have a blog, you can write articles, you can do LinkedIn live events where you bring people into a room like this on LinkedIn. There's so many different functionalities that you can have. So that for me right now is one of my absolute favorite channels in the digital space. In the traditional space, I actually think that I think mainstream media is great, but when you start talking about markets like Zambia or Kenya, etc., I think that depending on the business that you have, specifically for a market like Kenya, the media landscape is quite developed in Kenya. Actually, there's a lot happening in the media space, less so in Zambia. But I would say really do some research on the type of media outlets and the media publications and platforms that your particular audience interacts with more often. And then the last thing I would say is what I have really found to be effective with my B2B clients, especially now that the world has opened up again, is bringing people into a room and being able to kind of present your idea, etc. Media is great, but you know what I've started to say to my clients more often is media can act as an echo chamber of things that you're doing in real life. So you're not necessarily going to media to say, please, can you talk about my business, etc., etc. You're going to the media to say, I'm doing this. I'm hosting a stakeholder event. I am doing, X, Y, and Z. Please, can you cover that? Because that gives the media something a lot more tangible. It's a lot more meaty, and it's a lot more interesting and newsworthy than them just covering what you're doing as a business. So I think content is also very important. Think about the type of content that you're pitching to the media, right? So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I will take just one last question that we received in the chat, is that entrepreneurship can be sapping at the best of times. How do you manage your energy and grit?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. Sapping is even like a nice word, right? I'm telling you, after this, I'm going to go and take a long nap because it can drain you completely, but it's also super exciting. You know, I think obviously, I don't want to preach to the choir. We all know what we have to do, like, be able to take care of ourselves, etc., to kind of preserve energy. I always have this thing that you start your day with, people will say 100%, but none of us start with 100% in our tank of energy in our tank, right? Yeah. We probably start the day with like 80% in our tank at best. And so it's really being very careful about where you're spending that energy. The older I get, the more I get comfortable with saying no So no is a word that's starting to roll off my tongue really, really, really well. But in tandem with that question, I just want to put an idea to the room as well, which has been kind of a controversial idea that I've been working with a lot of my clients on. It's this idea of being authentic, right? You know how we're always told like we have to be authentic? Every leadership seminar you go to, every book that you read talks about being authentic.
Yeah.
And there is a guy called Mark Bowden. He is a body language expert and he's done a lot of work in this space. And he's got a TED talk. Please watch it if you have the time. It's called The Importance of Being Inauthentic, right? The importance of being inauthentic. And what he says is that being authentic all the time, specifically when you're an entrepreneur and you're in such a demanding field, can actually be extremely draining, but it can also help, it can make you miss opportunities for connections and opportunities for impact. So if I had to be authentic, I would not be here talking to you guys right now because I am an extreme introvert, right? My favorite thing to do in the whole world is to be by myself in a room reading a book. But my career depends on, and the impact that I have on the world depends on me doing things like this and interacting with people on a day-to-day basis all day long, right? So back to your question, I think it's really because sometimes we have to go out of our authentic self to be able to impact, to be able to build connections. It's that much more important to be able to give back to ourselves as well and to preserve our energy. So I don't have the silver bullet for that because I myself am still struggling with that, but it's a day to day. We learn every day and we try and manage as much as we can.
Maybe you can try coming to Mauritius and maybe working from here sometime soon.
I think so. I think so.
We look forward to having you here. Our door is always open for you, Mimi. Thank you so much for your valuable insights tonight. And it was really great learning from you and about from your experience, the importance of storytelling, creating a compelling storytelling for businesses. We hope that our audience found this webinar quite informative and that a few tips can apply to their businesses. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you to our next webinar, everybody. And Mimi, have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Swarna. Thank you so much to everybody. And yeah, all the best. And I'll see you guys online or maybe in Mauritius one day. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Have a great nap.
Thank you. I will. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.